In this video, we're going to be talking about command inputs. We'll give an example. We'll also show where it needs to go in the code and some of the syntax. So if we go into Fusion 360 here, we've already discussed how to define a command and put it into a toolbar. We've also talked about event handlers, so that if somebody presses my command, it's going to do something. We've created a class, and now within that class, we need to basically tell it what to show up here. So what kind of details or what kind of inputs do we have? So those are called command inputs. So let's go ahead and go online and look at that in the object model. So if I zoom in here to the user interface, we've already done a command definition. We've defined our command. We've also done a command created event, so that if somebody presses our command or our button, it goes into an event handler. It goes into its own function. Then within that function, we need to have command inputs, and that's what shows up in that dialog box. So notice how many different types of command inputs there are. We could have a float slider, or some type of integer slider, radial button. We're going to be doing a couple different ones that we'll go through, but since there's so many, that it's really useful for you to come in here to the code. So on the help documentation, under command inputs, there's a whole list here of different types of command inputs that you can do. And each one is going to have different syntax and different parameters that you're going to need. So we can't go through every one, but we'll go through a few here real quick. So one of the examples is the add selection input. So if we go back to Fusion 360, notice that I'm going to prompt the user to select something. This is one of my command inputs. I have 4 command inputs, 2 selection inputs, as well as 2 slider inputs. So the first one I'm going to have is just ask a user to select something. So let's look at the syntax in there. So first of all, if we're in Python, I need a command inputs variable. It's just referencing a command inputs object. And we saw that in the object model that we need to come down through command definitions and then command created event, and then or basically we're going to access command and then we're going to access command inputs. So once we have our command inputs, we just do dot add selection input, and then we need an ID, a name, and a command prompt. If you come down here, we can see that the ID, it's a unique ID that is specific to this command input. So it's what we're going to use to reference that specific command input, and we'll need to call that later. The second one is the name, and this is actually the displayed name that the user is going to see. We're not going to access it in the code by this name. We access it in the code by the ID, but the user sees it by the name. And then there's also a command prompt. It just is like a little tooltip. You can tell the user what to do. So, and then once you do that, it's going to return a selection command input. Now notice that there's a lot of different things that we can do once we have this command input object. So first of all is we can like set selection limits, so we can define how many selections they can make. So that's one thing that we're going to do. We're also going to add a selection filter so that we can we basically limit them on what they're going to be able to select. So let's look at that in the code. So once again, we're inside of my event handler. So as soon as they click that button, it comes into this function. And within this function, we again get the app, we get the UI, and then we go down to command like we saw. So we just do args.command, and then we do, I've called that CMD. So then within CMD, we just do cmd.command inputs. Just for reference, I'll just show that again. So once we do the application user interface, then we're jumping down here to command and then accessing command inputs. Then, like we saw in the help documentation, we just do inputs.add selection input, and then this is my unique ID that I've just called it selection 1, and then I've also, this is the name that they're going to see in the UI, selection location of poly 1, and then I also give them a prompt. So let's look at that in Fusion 360. We see that this is the name that they see, select location of poly 1. And then if I just stop, you can see by my cursor it says select a cylindrical face. So that's the tooltip here. So whatever they select from that is going to return, and it's going to be selection input 1. Now, within this command input like I said, we're going to set a limit on how many they can select. I'm just going to let them select only one item, and then we're also going to give them a filter that they can only select circular edges. So this whole thing just defines that input inside my dialog box. Now I notice I also had a slider bar, so this is something that you could look up in the reference material, but add a float slider list command input. And then I give it a unique ID, I give it a name, I give it units, and then I give it a value list, which I've created here. It's just an array, the different numbers that they can choose as they use that slider bar. So there's a lot of command inputs, there's a lot of syntax, so it's really good to get used to the reference material. I know we've only gone over a couple of them, but as you go through these, you'll get used to it and used to the different options that you can have. But like I said, it's really useful to come into this reference material and come in, and you'll see all the different options here. And then as you go in through this, you can see the different syntax. You can come into the return value and also see some of the different properties that you can do. So we would recommend going through a lot of that, and once you get through that, you can start adding different options and different inputs into your dialog box. But that's it for command inputs.